Welcome back to Product and Health Tech, a community for product leaders by product leaders. I'm Chris Hoyd, the Director of Product Management at Final. Today, I sat down with Angela Ha from Oma Robotics, an early stage startup focused on innovation in the IVF and fertility space. Angela shares some really great wisdom about how to successfully lead products at a new health tech startup. So let's jump into that conversation. Hey, Angela, good to see you again.
Hey, Chris.
It's been, I think, a couple of years since we last caught up. In the interim, you had moved to a new position, so you're leading product at a new company now.
I did. Yes. Yes, that has changed. And that is part of the nature in being an earlier stage. It's 1 year, 2 years can make a big difference at times.
And it sounds like an incredibly cool company. You're tackling some big problems with some, I think, really cool tech, both hardware and software, it sounds like. So I wonder if you could just kind of take a minute and tell us about the company you're at now, Oma Robotics, and what your role is at the company.
So yes, just a quick background on myself. My name is Angela. I'm currently head of product at Oma Robotics. We're also called Oma Fertility because we have a chain of fertility clinics. But the company was started by our three co-founders, really with the mission of making, fertility care more effective and also more accessible to anyone who would like to start a family. And so the company was really started when our co-founders visited a fertility clinic. They actually had a close friend or acquaintance of theirs who, spent tens of thousands on 6 IVF cycles, ended up having to declare bankruptcy and actually did not have a child to show for that. And, it became a really question of, wow, in this modern age, like IVF has been around for 30, 40 years at this point in time. And it was really just surprising that there wasn't really a lot of innovation. The fact that IVF exists is quite an innovation in itself, but in terms of, what is being done in the laboratory, it is still very, very much a manual process, that doesn't really hasn't been, I would say, innovated upon in the last 30, 40 years in many aspects of that. And so when they decided to start the company, there was definitely a focus in terms of, what we are doing in the lab to really help increase, efficacy of IVF. How do we make it more efficient so that, there's less reliance on, having to have a really big footprint or needing to have, really highly skilled people that are are in demand, such as embryologists. Like, what are some things that we could do to make all of that, again, more accessible, more efficient, more effective, so that more and more people can access this type of care. Now, with that being said, we also did stand up a number of fertility clinics. We also acquired a clinic. And a really important piece of that is understanding the patient journey of, people that do come to get fertility care services. Understanding how we can provide not only good outcomes, but this whole process, it's actually quite an emotional journey for the people that do come and seek fertility care. And it's a very long journey. So for some people, they might have to go through one round. Some people may have to go through multiple. Some people may, wonder if they need to get care over the course of many years before finally, going down the path. Again, it is a very expensive procedure. As we began to stand up our clinics, that became a big challenge really to understand, yes, we are building, product in the laboratory and, doing research there to really figure out what are ways to improve outcomes. But the truth is to make this care more accessible, to make it easier, to also just make it a more pleasant experience. There's a whole aspect of it that is patient facing, that deals with the actual clinics themselves, how they are operated. How do we do it in a scalable fashion so that it is a sustainable business, et cetera. And so, we do have a series of clinics that are in different locations throughout the United States. And, it is in many ways, both are kind of needed to really help us not only, continue the research and development in the lab, but also to really understand what that end-to-end journey is like for people that are going through this type of care and need a product like this to help, bring IVF to more people that, really need it. So that's just a little bit of background on what Oma Fertility is doing. My role as head of product, it varies depending on, I would say which phase of our growth we are in. So I'm happy to dive more into that. But it's really, being in an earlier stage, right now it's just me. I have, I'm working really closely in conjunction with our performance marketing. So I do have one person on my team that's focused on, growth, anything from let's make sure we're measuring our customer, our patient satisfaction, to another day it could be, what are some of the ways that we can improve conversion, from the different channels that we are marketing to, because again, fertility care is a lot of it is self-pay. It is a little bit different than other areas in the healthcare space where there's a lot of, reliance on insurance or, payer relationships and things like that. So, really just trying to find ways to help us grow, but also making sure that we are creating a good experience for our patients. So it varies. It's kind of runs the gamut, but it is also fun to be involved with different aspects of it.
An unbelievably complex and thorny and difficult challenge to undertake as an organization and as a head of products. I mean, just from, the biological complexity to, as you said, the sort of emotional weight of what the patients are going through, to having to kind of marry the clinic experience with, where the tech fits into it. That's incredibly bold project to tackle. Maybe because it's still kind of early stage and you are in this leadership role and the organization has evolved over the last, year plus. Can you walk us through a little bit, maybe give the other sort of product leaders or startup product leaders out there a sense of what it's been like for you to wear all the different hats and how that just kind of is part of the role?
Sure. So I think when I first joined, we were just in the process. We had one clinic and we were in the process of, standing up our other ones. So I think a big aspect around that was really understanding how we can provide a great patient experience and also in a way that is replicable. And, what are some of the things that we could do to make sure that there is some standardization or at least some standard way of measuring success. And again, this was still in progress. So these clinics were still not yet seeing patients. We had one that was seeing patients, but everything else, it was still in the process of building out everything from the actual buildings themselves, the actual clinics themselves, to staffing, to, getting the EMRs configured and things like that. And so in coming in, I think one of the first things I wanted to tackle was, as a product person, you always want to measure to some extent. So, a very simple, basic way to do that is through some definitive measurement of patient satisfaction. And so, just a small example of one of the things we tackled in the very beginning was let's just get a way to measure NPS out the door. We don't have to overcomplicate it. And so, again, just threw together some quick requirements using the existing tooling that we had. Our existing CRM tool, we quickly figured out, where in the patient journey. Again, there's different challenges because the patient journey is very long. Even, from the beginning of perhaps being interested in something like this to the point at which you're actually going through the procedure and going through, a cycle of IVF could take as long as, 4 to 5 months. Right. And so where do we ask the patient, what their experience is? So we decided to kind of take it at 2 different points in that patient journey. We launched it and, we actually have a really high response rate. So anywhere, depending on the clinic, between 15 to 20% of our patients actually respond. And a lot of them give detailed feedback and, and our NPS at our existing clinics are all above the 80 mark. It's above 70, many above 80. And so it was really nice that we were able to record that from the get-go so we could see, how the different clinics are doing. And again, that's just one example of a definitive measure of how are we actually providing the care? And of course, there's always going to be areas that we feel are maybe not coming together in the background operationally. But it was nice to, find ways to measure things as quickly as possible so that we know in the grand scheme, I think our patients are really loving our doctors. They're liking the care that we provide. And of course, in the cases where it's not perfect, we would know how to target it and how to fix it. So that's just one example. So I would say the first half, probably 2 quarters of my time at Oma was spent not only trying to measure some as definitively as we can in terms of what the patient experience is, but really understanding the end-to-end journey, which, as I mentioned, is very long. There is a heavy operational component, I will say, I think, which could be challenging sometimes for a product person because sometimes does feel like there's only so much you can influence. You can basically say like, hey, we kind of wrote out what this SOP would look like, but we do need to make sure that, people are trained appropriately. So there's, that aspect as well. But, from my perspective, really understanding it and mapping it out as best as we can, writing out the documentation on what we think this journey should look like, is at least something that a product person can really help drive that process, if you will. But it has to be working very closely in conjunction with our operational teams, our clinic teams, to see what is possible, what is not. A lot of times when people think product management, like my background is I built software at a lot of other companies where as at Oma, it was a little bit different where, yes, there was definitely a desire to build some tech, where there's tech in the lab, but then there's also the patient facing side. There was definitely some temptations to want to be like, ooh, should we, build something that is patient facing? And, so there was definitely a good bit of work to understand, technically, build or buy decision again in this space of like, does it make sense? It rarely makes sense to build your own EMR. So it's like, okay, is the EMR that we're using, tailored to our needs? Is it sufficient? Is the patient portal experience, on brand? Is it, what we'd like it to be? Is there some things to be desired? Is there some way we could build something to fill that gap? So there was definitely some analysis there as well to understand our tech stack in terms of the patient-facing side, and making some decisions on what would be best for what we would like to deliver in terms of a patient experience.
Right. And you feel like that laid a great foundation for Oma to continue to grow. Now that you understand that deeply, you've sort of documented and circulated it well within the organization. Like surely that, will be a good investment.
Yeah. I think there's certainly challenges. Like we have, documented things, but at the same time, we have 5 different clinics. They were all ramping up very quickly. We had to work closely in conjunction with them and, identify what are the things that we can and cannot institute. Where does it make sense to give the clinic some, leeway to kind of do things that works best for their patient population? It was certainly helpful, but it was only honestly the first step. I think there is a lot of things that would need to be, further operationalized. And that's kind of a constant, I would say, relationship that needs to be established with the clinics. And also really understanding what are, prioritizing what are the key things. So there's always going to be, things that could be better. But there's always going to be like a few things that float to the top, like whether it's like patient communication, how do we make it easier for them to communicate with the clinic? That's just one example. Then frankly, in the health tech space, I think a huge part of it is always going to be the EMR. You're not going to want to introduce a ton of different tools to your clinics, right? You're not going to, your medical assistants, your nurses, like they're already running around. Like I visited all of our clinics. It gets busy. People are, doing a ton of things already. So one of the challenges, like how do you not put more tech on them, more processes, more tools that they need to use? So, ideally you find an EMR that satisfies a lot of those needs. You're not really making them do much else on top of it. I think in healthcare especially, I feel like the temptation of paper is always very strong. And so if if either A, your tool doesn't satisfy what you need it to do, or B, the tool itself wasn't configured or the staff wasn't trained, then you have these gaps where you have a lot of things that are lost in heaps of paper. We're always trying to get away from paper, but it feels like the never ending. I've been at other companies, other healthcare companies. It's, like fax. Like I feel like sometimes it feels like the uphill battle of like, is this ever going to go away? Right. And I think that is a very real thing at any healthcare, like at least healthcare, at least when it comes to like clinics, when it comes to any kind of medical delivery. That's a really, really huge piece. And, even if the temptation is there to maybe change EMRs to build something, I think one of my learnings is that like a big part of it, as not glamorous as it is just to make sure your existing setup is like consistent and also that the staff is like well trained so that there is appropriate training and documentation on how to use what you already have. Again, it doesn't feel very, as someone who likes to build things, it's like, right. It feels not necessarily as like exciting sometimes, but, hands down, it's one of the most important things to ensure that, you have a smoothly running operation, because that at the end of the day, it does two things, right? It's for the patient experience. Yes. Like at the end of the day, if everyone is clear on who needs to be communicated with and like, how to reach out back to the patient, et cetera, like that affects their experience. Oftentimes when they have a bad experience, it's because something was miscommunicated, right? So that if I look into our data, if I look into our responses, if anything ever kind of went sideways, is always because, oh, so-and-so told me this, but then so-and-so said something different, or, and so those are all things that could be addressed if you had appropriate, like, hey, this is the one place you look, right? Or this is the one place you document something about a patient. But of course, also just operationally, you're not wasting time of your staff who, could be always better utilized if they're not spending time transcribing something that was written into the EMR after the fact, as an example. So
a lot of, it sounds like hard won sort of lessons there about how to do this well and how to honor the patient journey, especially as they're going through something as sensitive as this. It sounds like, you talked about sort of finding a tool that can be a single source of truth, sort of honoring the norms of the various disciplines that do get busy and have to kind of respond to things in real time with patients. It sounds like so much of your job is and has been really kind of a connective tissue of these different departments, whether it's growth or clinical or the ops team. Do you have an approach to that, or is it just you've got the experience and you kind of have developed the muscle memory of how to do that?
That's a great question. I think any leader, but as a product person, I think it's really important. Maybe the most important skill that I'm trying to hone is just to listen. I like talking. We're on a podcast. I love talking. but I think I feel you can learn so much about your business just by speaking with the various leaders and stakeholders, and they don't have to be leaders. They could, and in fact, like the most I learn oftentimes is from customer success, because they're like, hey, and obviously talking to the patients as well, but that's kind of a given. I feel like as a product person, you need to talk to your customers. So go talk to your customers, learn about what they're looking for. But I think like your patient experience is, yes, there's different pieces. Oftentimes, maybe there is a technological piece. Maybe they have a portal. Maybe there's a website. Maybe there is, something that they have to interact with digitally. But 90% of what is in the background, yes, there's some tech, but there is a lot of people. There is likely a provider. There are, other healthcare professionals. There are, clinic staff. It's such a big part of how you deliver that experience. So the tech piece in many ways is like, it's a tool, it helps. But a huge part is really understanding, like, how does everyone kind of in the background run? How does that business run? What are their priorities and pain points and, goals? And so I think this is especially true in health tech, but I think in my own experience, I've been in a lot of companies, I guess maybe less SaaS, right? These are more, companies that have a heavy, I would say, like operational component to it as well to deliver some kind of experience. So like I was previous at DoorDash, for example, where, yes, there's an app that you use to order the food, but there are people driving, there are merchants that need to know when they need to make the food. And there's a huge operational component behind it. And you need to really be partnered up closely with those that are managing that. Of course, the tech needs to work, but that's almost like a given.
Right.
And so I feel like what I've learned in my time at these different companies is, really understanding, how are these different teams, let's say operation, let's say maybe marketing, like what are they really trying to drive? And product can be a really great partner in all of these aspects. So, in addition to listening, I often like to ask, how can I make your life easier? Because everyone's lives are already hard. We all have a lot of stuff on our plates. So, in order for product to partner with any of these, I would say, these stakeholders, it's like, yeah, how can we help them achieve their goals? Because, if in a good organization, your goals should generally be fairly aligned. Like we're trying to build a good business. And so hopefully it's not like completely different. So by helping them, I'm helping myself as well, right? As a product person, like, okay, what do we need to build? If I'm working with marketing, like, which are the customers we're trying to attract right now? What are the channels? Okay, cool. We're trying to attract more people via Google search. Like that is giving us a better, let's say, return on investment. Cool. That means I need to maybe help you guys make it easier to experiment with different search landing pages,
Right.
and so I think it's actually super important to know like what are the priorities, right? So it's a lot of listening and trying to figure out, okay, how can I align the things that product can do to help move things in the right direction.
Man, I love that. I love thinking about, because product is often they are the in the best position to be that connective tissue, and so
Hmm.
to give yourself the sort of space to listen and, as you said, kind of distill your inputs and turn it into, an opinion, right? Maybe a weakly held point of view about something that the company should do. That's a really
Hmm.
cool way to think about it. Do you, and not to get too tactical on that, but I think a lot of PMs can, the calendars can get full, right? So it's meeting after meeting after meeting. You're managing stakeholders across the board, and maybe
Hmm.
you end up sacrificing some of the time or just kind of internal space that might be required to develop that point of view effectively. So, have
Yeah.
you run into that, or are you just good enough at that at this point that you don't need to intentionally protect your
That's
time?
that's always going to be a journey, and I think it also depends on the company culture as well. I've been in meeting heavy cultures. I always block my calendar. I do that. I will make sure that on a weekly basis I have a few 2 3 hour chunks of time. I just put it as focus block, and yes, people in theory can book over it, but so that's kind of how I try to protect my time. And selfishly, I try to initiate all the meetings. If it's like I
Right.
try to. So there's a little bit of that too. But I think one thing I've gotten better with over the years is just to be honest with like, do you actually need me here? Or if it's my like any recurring meetings, being very, I would say like not shy of being like, do we still need to do this today? Like I just canceled the meeting right before this one. I told my two stakeholders, like I don't think we have anything to talk about today. I'm going to cancel it. If something changes, we'll revisit. I'll schedule something else. And I feel like 8 out of 10 times, you do that, no one's going to be like, oh wait,
Right.
hold up, we actually had this thing, and then it ends up. And if it does, that's fine. We'll put something back on the calendar. So I've gotten better about chopping my own meetings. And if there isn't a clear agenda, chop it, get rid of it. And then if my presence is ever kind of questioned, like, do I really need to be there? I do try to pop in here and there just to get context. But again, I feel like the time that you get, if you can carve out a good chunk to whether it is to run some reports and dive into the data, all of that always takes time. Or like setting up time to talk to customers, all of that takes time. So I feel like it's just being a little bit ruthless about it. And I know that's like talked about like a lot, but it's true. And
Mhm.
so I don't feel bad about not going to meetings, especially if it's clear that I don't have a clear role in it. I decline. And if I have, and my goal is to have meetings. If it doesn't have an agenda, it's gone. Like,
Right.
yes, even for recurring meetings, if there isn't anything specific, I delete it.
I'd want to take just a minute here and give you a chance to share if there's anything that your team or Oma generally has shipped recently that you're proud of.
So something that we recently shipped, which sounds simple, sounds basic, but anyone that's worked in this space would understand the nuance that it took. So I'll preface it with that. So we recently, very recently, launched the ability for patients to schedule their own first appointment. Now, I know it sounds super basic in many ways because you're like, okay, yeah, if I'm trying to, buy movie tickets, I could just go and like, pay and then have it be done. But in the healthcare context, like, it's actually not that straightforward. There are a few different things that come into play, whether, for one, information and integration with EMR. It is honestly a bit of a struggle, in the at least with the current options that we have today to create a very user-friendly workflow that allows a patient to put themselves on our clinician schedule and show up in our EMR in an integrated fashion. So I'll just leave it at that. So there's some challenges there that has, I think, historically made it a little difficult, especially if you don't own the tech pieces and you're trying to work with slash against, what tools you have in place, especially on the EMR side. And then secondly, there's an operational piece of, I think as you are preparing a patient for a visit, there's actually a lot of different things you need to do to prep them. So there's the question of like, what are the different pieces of information, whether it's insurance, whether it's making sure they sign their HIPAA, notice and things like that. and to make sure that they're actually prepared for their, very first visit. And so in a lot of times, I think clinics or companies even shy away from letting someone schedule their own appointment. I know from a consumer standpoint, it sounds very straightforward, but it's actually not that frequent. Like there are other companies out there where you can do this, right? Very maybe like direct consumer specific companies where you can schedule your own visit, with a provider of some sort. But in the fertility space, it's, there's actually a lot of different components that need to come together. And so, we recently launched this capability and it's very new. So we have still yet to see the results, but we're really proud that, we launched this capability where patients can then come through, and it's only open to some of our clinics right now, but they can, again, pay, get on our calendar, and reserve a appointment with our physician. And then there are still some pieces that we need to do to make sure that they're ready for it and all that stuff. But, again, the goal of this is to help improve our patient conversion. I think, some patients don't mind speaking to someone and making sure they're like comfortable before they move forward. But our hypothesis is there's definitely a cohort of people out there that would just be like, you know what, I think I know what I want. I just want to speak with the doctor. Let me just put in my availability. Let me just pay for this appointment and let me just show up and then go from there. So that's something that, the most recent thing that we launched that, took us a bit of time to kind of figure out technically and operationally, but that's as much as I can share for the time being.
Very cool. Extremely impressive. I feel like I could kind of talk to you about this all day, but I think we are at time here. So I will just close by asking if you have any sort of preferred ways, if anyone in the community wants to reach out to you and connect, maybe LinkedIn or email.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is always good. I feel like the last few jobs that I've companies that I ended up going to is like a LinkedIn reach out. So I feel like LinkedIn is the great equalizer. I'm happy to connect with anyone. And I actually do love talking to other folks in the product space because everyone's, I think, experiences are so different. There's some trends and key things of of being an early product leader, especially only product person, I think there's a lot of unique struggles at different challenges at different companies, but in many ways, the themes are very similar, and it's really nice to connect with other people that are going through that as well. So I'm always happy to connect.
Thank you so much, Angela. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or on our website at productandhealthtech.com. If you have ideas or suggestions on what you'd like to hear on a future episode, or if you'd like to be a guest, please just shoot us an email at info@productandhealthtech.com.